So to use the rolling mill, take your piece of metal. Now ideally, if you're doing anything other than just sampling, you need to first check your metal for any scratches. Any scratches or unwanted marks on there. Because if you impart a nice delicate open pattern onto your metal and there were already scratches on there, you've got no way of later removing those scratches without also removing the pattern that you've put on your work. So this is just a little demo. I'm not going to bother sanding it, but like I say, good practice. Check it, sand it, make sure it's in the best state it possibly can be before putting it through the roller. And you also need to make sure the rollers are clean as well, because any little lumpy bits of tape, bits of leaf stuck on there will also impart in texture onto your metal. So I'll show you how to do that, but the way I like to do it is with a little bit of wire wool. Just give them a scrub. When you're ready to cut your texture out, there's different ways you can do it. So the way I like to do it is cut it a tiny bit bigger than my metal and just roll it through as is. So with this, I'd be taking my scissors, cutting it a tiny bit bigger than the metal, like that, and then I'm just going to feed it through the machine, through the roller mill, just like that. Now the reason being, this is nice and soft and squidgy, so this isn't going to mark the rollers, so I don't need to protect them. And also because it's a little bit wider, as long as I hold on to it when it feeds through, it shouldn't be shifting as it goes through the machine. If I was wanting to do something that was more fiddly and I needed it to stay in place when it goes through the machine, I would use masking tape to tape it down. But there's a bit of a trick to that, so I'm going to show you that separately in a minute. But for just now, I say just a bit wider than my piece of metal, and I'm going to feed it straight through. So before I put it through the machine, I'm just going to check the rollers. So I'm going to give the handle a little turn so that the roller starts to turn around, and I'm going to check there's no bits of tape or bits of leaf or anything stuck on there which will also imprint. If there are little bits stuck on there, I like to take some really fine wire wool and just give them a little scrub. And that tends to be enough to take off any little sticky bits without it damaging the rollers. Then what I'm going to do is get this to the right height for my piece of metal so that when it goes through, the material gets squished into the surface a little bit. So to adjust the size of the rollers, with most machines it's lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Some of them are back to front though. This one is lefty-loosey and the gap gets bigger. One of the things people struggle with a lot is getting the tension right, because these rollers need to be set with a gap that's tight enough to squash this material into this metal. If it's too loose, it's not going to imprint. If it's too tight, it's either going to jam and get stuck, or you're going to completely mangle your piece of metal and it's going to get really long and really curvy and misshapen. So to get the tension right, take your piece of metal, make sure you've opened the rollers up enough so that you can slide the metal all the way through. Now I've got to try and do this one-handed. When the metal's between the rollers, I'm going to hand tighten it until I can't get that piece of metal out and it's not wibbling around. So I know that those rollers are set to the same thickness as my piece of metal. At that point, I'm going to look at my dial. So most rolling mills have a dial on them, and some of them, like this one, have a little arrow. So all I need to do is look at that arrow and see see what number it's lining up with. So it's just to the left of 0.75. If you have a rolling mill that doesn't have a dial, you could use a Sharpie or some Tipp-Ex to make some marks on here, or sometimes the little arrow and the lines are over there. It doesn't really matter, it's just some way where you can remember how far this was turned to be the same thickness as this. So like say for me, it's just to the left hand side of 0.875. So now I'm going to loosen this, take my metal out and put it back. So now I've set my rollers back to the 0.875 on the dial, and I'm going to take my piece of metal, my piece of fabric, I'm just going to hold it in place and I'm going to feed it through the rollers. But I'm going to do it from this side so you can see it come out the other side. So to feed it through, I'm holding my piece of metal in the middle of the flat part of the rollers and I'm turning this handle. And you want it to be tight enough that you're having to put some pressure on, but not so much that you're having to jump up and down on the handle to get it to go through. There we go. And there we go, one little lace texture. It's come out quite nice. Now, generally anything that goes through the machine is one use only because it gets a bit squashed and mangled. If you want to do a double texture, so either because you've got a material that you've only got one of or it was more expensive, so therefore you want to get as many imprints as possible out of it, or if you're trying to make a matching pair of things, what you can do is make a little sandwich of metal. So I've got a piece of brass that's been annealed, I've got a piece of sequin waste that I'm going to use for my texture, and another piece of brass is going to go on top, and I'm going to feed that through the machine to end up with a mirror image texture. But before I feed it through, I'm going to set the size. So I'm going to take my stack of metal and I'm going to get the rollers, get the gap the right size to fit that nice and snugly. I loosen the roller until it fit. I've hand tightened it and I'm going to look at my arrow to see the number. I'm going to loosen it, take my metal out, put it back to where it was. So it was about there. And now I'm going to make my little sandwich again. And that's ready to feed through. The other important thing is whatever you feed through your machine, can't get this straight, needs to be narrower than your rollers, but it doesn't necessarily mean the entire width of your roller. It means narrower than the flat bit, because if it's too close to this edge, it's going to get pulled in and mangled in the workings of the machine, and if it's too close to this side, it's going to get pulled in and mangled in the wire recesses. So it needs to be narrower than this flat section, and it's always good to feed it right through the middle. Matching pattern. This time 2 strips of copper and my piece of lace again. And there we go. If you want to use something for a texture where you could do with having a bit more security, so sticking it in place, I like to use masking tape to stick it to the surface. But what I always tell people to do is make a little sandwich, because if I was to stick this tape on like that and then fold the tape over, it's going to leave lines wherever there's an edge of tape touching the surface of the metal. Whereas if I take another piece of tape and stick it on the other side, creating a sandwich, stick it down nice and secure around the edges, then my little shape is stuck in place, but I don't have any folded edges that are going to leave a mark. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to trim off some of this excess tape and I'm going to roll it through the rolling mill. There we go, little shape stuck in place exactly where I wanted it, taped down both sides, little sandwich so there's no folded edges that are going to mark it. And now I'm ready to run it through the machine. So I've already set it same way as before. I'm going to try and do it one-handed, and again same as before, I'm putting it in the middle of this flat section so that it doesn't get pulled in and mangled in there. And now I'm going to turn the handle. Oh, it's difficult one-handed. There we go. That looks like it's rolled well. So now I just need to take the tape off, which again is going to be a bit tricky one-handed. Give it a go. Little butterfly, imprinted in brass, made by rolling it through a rolling mill using some cupcake wrappers. Dead cheap. Nice pattern. As you can see, the tape leaves a slight mark of its own when you use it, but I quite like it. And it does buff off quite easily as well, if need be. That's a little bit of tape. As you can see, quite often when things come out of the rolling mill, they come out a bit bent, like these. But as long as you use a non-metal hammer, as long as you use your rawhide mallet or your rubber mallet, you'll be able to flatten them down without losing the pattern. And in fact, you can hammer them into steel formers and still keep the pattern, similar to these little ones.